you all. Thank you very much for coming out on this beautiful evening. So my job tonight is to introduce the folks that have sponsored this event, and that is the City of Kenmore, and I'll be introducing Dr. Alan Van Ness, who's our Deputy Mayor on the City Council, and also Pastor Anya Hellman, who's the pastor with the North Lake Church, and she is part of the Kenmore Bothell Interfaith Group. So our two organizations have co-sponsored this event. So thank you to Pastor Anya and her group and to the City Council. So that's all I have to say, because I know you're anxious to hear what this wonderful panel have got to say to you about affordable housing and listen to their success stories. So that's all I have to say. So Dr. Van Ness.
Thank you, Debbie. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. The City of Kenmore is very proud and happy to sponsor or help sponsor this kind of an event. One of the things that we had, through the recession, hoping that the economy would rebound and we'd have significant economic growth in the Seattle-King County area. And by golly, we've had it. And with that comes some unintended consequences like congestion on the highways and escalating housing prices. And so we have to deal with that in some way. And we've been working in the city with our council and our planning commission in the last year, working on a strategy for affordable housing. I'd rather call it workforce housing. Housing for the average workforce individual, the starting school teacher, the police officer, the bank teller. Housing prices are really going through the roof in the Seattle-King County area. And hopefully tonight we're going to hear about, well, I know we are going to hear about some success stories and how we can approach this in the future. So welcome you all. I'll turn the microphone over to Pastor Anya. Thank you for helping with this.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Yes, I am Anya Hellman, pastor at North Lake Lutheran Church, and here tonight I am representing the Kenmore Bothell Interfaith Group, which we call KBIG. KBIG for short. So we at KBIG have been talking about housing issues for at least a few years or so, and I'm finding that we become more and more focused on that over the last few years. And I think it's because of a lot of what the Deputy Mayor, Alan, was talking about. It's becoming more and more relevant to us in this time and in this place of Kenmore. It is so exciting to be in Kenmore and to see the amazing things happening here, because we are seeing Kenmore grow. We are seeing this strength in community happen, and I've just been loving witnessing all of that. But as he mentioned, that with that, what we see in a lot of cities is there's a certain group of people that often get pushed out. And I know, as I'm sure all of you, we don't want that to happen here. And so we want Kenmore to be a place where all people have a home and can always have that home. So with that, we are just excited to be invited to be here tonight. And we just wanted to say a quick welcome and a thank you to the city for hosting this event, to our panelists for guiding the discussion and facilitating that conversation, and to all of you for being willing to spend the time here and engage and being open to whatever possibilities will come up for us tonight. So thank you. And I think, back to Lori.
Well, good evening. I'm the fourth person to talk, and I have 3 tasks. The first one is to give you some general information on housing affordability, a short little segment, and then I'm going to talk about the agenda for this evening, and then lastly I'm going to make some brief introductions of our panelists and moderator tonight. So to start, today is the first day of Affordable Housing Week, and our City Council a few weeks ago issued a proclamation saying that we would acknowledge that this week in Kenmore, hence the panel that you see this evening. So why are we interested in this issue? As you know, housing prices have increased dramatically, and I got some information from our housing people, and they told me that the average rent in the Bothell-Kenmore market area has increased 48% since 2012. Housing prices sales prices have gone up 85%. All of this at a time when median household income has gone up 9%. 70% of people of moderate or low income in Kenmore are what's called housing cost burdened. In other words, they spend more than the recommended 30% of their incomes towards housing. And of that 70%, a significant portion pay more than 50% of their household income for housing. Now, why is that relevant? Well, because it means that all that money that goes to housing can't go to other necessities like food or medicine or transportation or child care. And then I also wanted to make a few comments about homelessness. In 2016, the one-night count of the homeless found 135 people living either outdoors or in their vehicle in the north part of the county. Likewise, the North Shore School District in the 2015-2016 school year identified 203 students that they thought were homeless. So it's an issue. And the Kenmore City Council recently passed a housing strategy plan. That's a menu of tools and techniques that we might use to address affordable housing issues. We're going to be looking at that over the next several years, and we thought it would be useful to have a panel talk about success stories, what has worked. Either it may not be relevant for our community, or maybe it is, or maybe it's relevant to another community in our area. And so we're hoping that all of you will stay engaged, that you will pay attention to the actions that the city and other jurisdictions are taking around affordable housing. And we very much appreciate you coming here tonight and hope you find something interesting and educational. Task number 2, the agenda. What are we doing this evening? So our panelists, each one is going to speak for about 10 minutes on their success stories. And I started to say story, but all of them have multiple stories. After their presentations individually, we'll have a real brief, it'll be a kind of a clarifying question time period where 1 or 2 questions can be answered. After all of them have spoken, we are going to have a more robust question and answer period, and that's why the cards were on the chairs. I'm sure you were all wondering about that. So if you have a pen, or if you need a pen, or you have a pencil, the goal is for you to write your questions as you're listening to the conversations on a card. And then we'll collect the cards, and at that time we'll probably say, stand up, stretch, get a cup of coffee, get a cookie. We'll collect the cards and give them to our moderator, and then he'll be the one helping with the question and answer period. At the end of the evening, after the question and answer period, we're hoping that you'll respond to some of our questions, and we've put them on, there are 3 easels at the back. There are big questions written on them, and we're hoping to get feedback from you on those questions. So we don't have a huge group of people clustered around trying to write on those white pieces of paper. There are sticky notes on every table. You can write your response on a sticky note and then paste it right on the white sheet. So again, thank you very much for coming. And now I'd like to just spend a minute introducing the panel briefly. They're going to talk more about themselves and how they got into the affordable housing arena as part of their presentation. So Arthur Sullivan with ARCH, that's our Regional Coalition for Housing, is our moderator this evening. He's the program manager with ARCH, and ARCH is a unique coalition of member jurisdictions who work together on housing issues. So Arthur and his staff provide education, they provide expertise to the member jurisdictions on the housing topics, and we consider Arthur and his staff our housing staff, and that's why we asked him to be our moderator this evening. ARCH also administers a housing trust fund that is funded by contributions from the member jurisdictions. Then our panelists, thank you again very much for being here, are Eric Campbell with Main Street Property Group, Beth Borum with Beacon Development, and Dan Watson from the King County Housing Authority. So with that, I'll turn it over to Arthur.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. And I'm not going to go into more detail about the background of our panelists, other than to say that collectively you probably have as much experience between 3 or 4 people around the issues of housing and affordable housing in King County as you could probably find in the county. Trust me, they have a lot of years of experience. I won't tell you how many, but it is a lot. I would also say I've had the pleasure of working with all of the panelists over the years, and what distinguishes them in my mind is that these have been people who are very innovative and have always been working and developing new wrinkles to address housing issues. They're not looking in the past, they're looking to the future. And so I think you should be very happy to have Beth, Dan, and Eric with us tonight. In their comments, they're going to talk a little bit about themselves, where we've asked them to think about, give us a couple examples of some specific projects and efforts they've been involved in. And then they're also going to talk a little bit about lessons learned, and then also how the housing they do benefits the broader community, and as well as just sort of the people, the residents that it's being targeted for. I've also asked, because somebody from the audience came to me at the beginning of the meeting, and I've asked them as they're describing it, because someone asked me the question, can you give us what is a definition of affordable housing, and who is the intended targeted residents of affordable housing? And the answer is there's a wide range. And I think what you'll see from the panelists and the examples they give, that it can be a wide range of types of households. So I'm going to just stop there if you feel like you want to follow up on that later in your follow-up questions. But I think the main point is, in my experience of working for 25-plus years in East King County, that the range of different types, seniors and families and homeless and people with special needs and different income levels and first-time homeowners, there's a lot of different needs in our communities that are trying to be addressed by the groups, by both the private, the nonprofit, and the housing authority sector in our community. So with that, I think we're going to have Dan Watson from the Housing Authority start first.
Thank you, Arthur. And let me first start by saying how delighted I am to be here and address the Kenmore community on the subject of affordable housing. I've been with the King County Housing Authority and been the deputy director for quite a number of years, and have watched communities grow and thrive and all of the housing that goes with it as well. And I think it's one of the sort of couple of good news, bad news things. It used to be, before we had this crisis in affordable housing, it was always a challenge sometimes to convince people that you actually had a need for it, that this was something that should be part of every community. And with, I think, as difficult as the housing situation is for so many people, most folks I know and most leaders I know are certainly well acquainted with the problem. We can differ on the solutions, but no one seems to disagree that it's a problem that needs to be addressed. And the other thing that I find out from time to time is people have sometimes trouble connecting housing and economic growth, and understanding that as we all benefit from growth, housing and the cost of housing is an unfortunate side effect that is actually part of the whole economic issues that we deal with, that as we grow and as our economy grows and as income grows, housing costs go up, particularly employment. So I like to think, and I think Arthur said, well, let's talk a little bit about what the benefits of housing and affordable housing. And I read an article once that I thought was really quite right on the mark. If you look at the bigger issue around housing, housing can be considered like infrastructure, every bit as important as streets, roads, utilities, and other kinds of things. Every community and economy needs places for people to live and to work, and those two kind of have to come together. But what I really wanted to talk about tonight were the kind of the things that our agency has been particularly successful with, and not a lot of other agencies are able to pull this off, but we've done a lot of what we call apartment acquisitions. We've also dealt with preservation of mobile home parks, and those are two kind of important stories to talk about in a little bit more depth than you normally get. And one thing I wanted to say about the King County Housing Authority, because a lot of people are confused about what a housing authority is. We are not part of county government. We almost get very little money from the county government. We are chartered by the county. But we operate independently with our own board of directors, and we are primarily entrepreneurial and federally funded. And as you may know, the mainstay of the programs that housing authorities are commonly connected with are things like Section 8 and public housing. But they are very much of a core part of our mission, serving the homeless and the very low income and other vulnerable populations, a big part of what we do. But what sets the King County Housing Authority apart is we have over 4,000 units of acquired apartments. They're kind of a mixed income workforce, primarily housing resource for the community. Very few housing authorities have that. And over 25 years, we've developed this 4,000 unit portfolio over 100 different apartment properties. And you see up here are some recent examples of the different properties that we have purchased over the years. And the reason that we do apartment acquisitions as opposed to, and you'll hear a lot more about new development and construction, which is the more typical way to provide affordable housing because that's the easiest way to access subsidies. But acquisition of your existing apartments, and we look for those kind of 20-year-old, what we call Class B apartments that really are kind of the backbone of what is the private sector's more affordable apartments. We've been buying those up over the years. They're quite a bit cheaper than building new. They're probably considerably below replacement cost. For us, there's less risk. You know what you're buying. You know the neighborhood. You know the people that are living there before you buy it, and you kind of have a very certain stream of income, which is really important when it comes to sort of how to pay for it. And the rents, you know those. And what we do, our strategy here is when we buy an apartment, like Woodland North, which is down actually in Lake Forest Park, but it's not too far from here. I think that's the closest acquisition that we've made to the City Hall. You know, when you buy those, you can then keep the rents the same or close to the original rents over time. So these properties that we bought, in some cases 20 or 25 years ago, over time they get increasingly affordable for the workforce population. We're also able to layer on additional subsidies which allow us to serve very low income within a mixed income environment. So those are some of the advantages. We also always use private management companies. So when you drive by a Woodland North, you probably wouldn't know that we actually are the owners. It just looks like any other apartment in the neighborhood, and the only difference being maybe the affordability of the rents at that particular complex. But we think that, again, you're looking for strategies, you're looking for success stories. I think it's fair to say that we think preservation of some of the more affordable housing in a community is a strategy that really needs to probably even be more embraced more than it already is. All of the issues around trying to find sites for new construction, all of the environmental, land use, and zoning issues that go with it are largely avoided, fortunately for our sake, when you buy an existing apartment complex. You just have to make sure you're there to fix it up, make sure it's well maintained, well managed, and then over time we're able to sort of work on making it increasingly affordable. Now, the way we do this, just if you're interested in is primarily we just borrow the money. Again, we borrow the money against the stream of revenue, against the rental revenue. We do not pay things like some property taxes and some other things that make it more affordable for us to buy, but basically there's not always a whole lot of subsidies involved when we've done these acquisitions, at least not in the beginning, and we'll add subsidies as time goes on. So that's a little bit of the formula for doing this, and we've been very successful. We continue to buy more and more. Now, as prices have gone up, we have found that we cannot borrow or leverage as much debt, and we have to come up with other sources of equity, just like in a house. And also we're finding that when we go out and try to buy any apartment, it's just like buying a house now, there are multiple offers. In other words, they're being bid up as we speak, and so it's getting to be an incredibly competitive market to buy any kind of real estate, whether it be apartments, whether it be homes, whether it be just raw land. So some of the disadvantages, though, and why a lot of other organizations, and particularly nonprofits and affordable housing providers, I think struggle with the concept, is that to buy an apartment complex, you got to come up with a lot of money in a relatively short period of time, like 90 days. And so it takes, and we've been able to develop some capital resources because we have this asset base. We're able to borrow money in ways that others sometimes aren't. So that's one of the problems. And so when you're borrowing that much money, you have to be awfully careful not to either overpay or over leverage. And a few housing agencies in this region have gotten themselves in trouble by either overpaying for the property or over leveraging. And so that's another kind of risk that smaller organizations perhaps wouldn't want to shoulder. So one other kind of preservation that I wanted to talk about, because I think it's particularly germane to the Bothell, Kenmore area, are mobile home parks. And mobile home parks are places where a lot of very low-income, particularly senior citizens live, especially the older parks. They're a form of affordable housing, often low-income housing, and they are quite at risk of being redeveloped. And we're seeing it in other parts of the county where the zoning permits mobile home parks to be built at a higher and better use. In the SeaTac and Des Moines area right now, there are 2 mobile home parks that are going to be torn down. One is going to be an apartment complex. The other is going to be a hotel and apartment complex. And the people are being displaced. They have nowhere to go. They're leasing the land, so they don't have any ownership rights whatsoever. And the mobile home they live in really isn't mobile. It can't really be moved, especially the older ones. There's no place to put them. There are no spaces in King County. So whatever equity they have, whatever cash they paid for that house is pretty much gone forever. Not to mention the whole problem of where do they move to. And a lot of these folks are much lower income than people that live in apartments. So it's a real problem when it happens. Now, it can be avoided, and I think it's the case in Bothell. I know it's Bothell is a case where it's those mobile home parks are zoned for mobile home parks. They'd have to be rezoned to be to a higher and better use. So they're not as lucrative a candidates right out of the gates as other types of mobile home parks in other places. Now, I have up on the screen here earlier was the Wonderland Estates mobile home park. That was one that was going to be closed because it was going to be annexed into the city of Renton, which actually has mobile home park zoning, from King County, which didn't. So the higher and better use was a townhouse development, which the owner decided he was going to pursue and vest his land so he could develop it as townhomes. We were able to intervene at the bequest of a whole lot of people and the state legislature and the county council and buy that mobile home park and keep it as it was since about 1960. So we're then keeping the rents affordable and allowing people to stay in place. But a lot of people had moved out, and a lot of people were ready to move out, and we finally got to the owner and convinced him to sell, and that preserved 109 spaces for what are largely low-income senior citizens. So that's another strategy that we've pursued, and I think it's one that, again, it's this whole notion of preservation. And we had a situation in Bellevue recently where it wasn't a mobile home park, it was just a regular apartment complex that was going to be torn down. It was in 76 units of apartments. It was going to be torn down, so 89 townhomes could be sold. They were willing to pay over $200,000 a unit for their land cost to build for sale housing. And we were able to intervene and stop that. But that just shows you how challenging the economics are now for certain types of housing, particularly for low-density, for-sale housing. You hear about all the tear-downs in single-family homes. Now you're seeing tear-downs of apartment buildings to do something similar. So anyway, that's just kind of a brief synopsis of what we consider to have been pretty successful is the whole idea of acquisition and preservation, and then able to, over time, in this case sometimes a very long time, 20 to 25 years, to increasingly pay down the debt, keep the rents affordable, because all we have to do is cover increases in operating costs, and before you know it, those rents are hundreds of dollars below the market. So that's kind of a brief summary, and now I'm going to turn it back to Arthur.
So does anyone have a clarifying question, anything that Dan brought up that wasn't quite clear to you? Otherwise, bigger questions we'll save for later. He did a great explanation, so it looks like everyone fully understands it. That's great.
They didn't understand a word I said.
All right, so now we're going to have Beth Borum from Beacon Development talk about some of her experiences.
So thank you for having me. Yes, I'm Beth Borum with Beacon Development, and I've been in the affordable housing world for 20 years. I started out as a VISTA volunteer and have worked in consulting firms and as well as a developer owner. So currently I work for Beacon Development Group, and we are a nonprofit affordable housing development firm, and we work with nonprofits and housing authorities primarily. And the projects that I'm going to talk about are projects that I worked on when I was an owner-developer with Compass Housing Alliance, and Beacon Development helped us develop these projects. So the two projects that I'm thinking about, they're very, very different than what Dan just talked about. It's a whole different side of the affordable housing development project type. So these two projects, what they took to make them happen was a lot of partners. So they're not projects that would have happened even without some extraordinary circumstances, and they weren't easy because of the time that it took to put these to do these kind of challenging types of development. So the first one is it's actually in Seattle. It's called Compass on Dexter, and Compass was able to work with a church to purchase their land in South Lake Union. And this church was a Lutheran church that was had been there a long time, and they didn't need this piece of property, and they felt they had this real desire to they saw the neighborhood changing, and they saw a desire to leave a legacy in the community. And so we were able to convince them that it would be a good idea to build family housing in South Lake Union for homeless families. And the reason that this couldn't have happened otherwise is that the church was able to sell their land for less than it was worth. And so we purchased their parking lot, and we built parking for the church on the site where the housing was built. And this was just before the rezones in South Lake Union, so the property values hadn't quite skyrocketed yet. But luckily we were in Seattle, and Seattle is a relatively resource-rich environment for affordable housing. It's harder outside Seattle. My next project that I'll explain is outside Seattle. So we were able to get the project financed and built with lots of funding sources, the low-income housing tax credit, City of Seattle, Washington State, serving homeless families. So a lot of subsidy, a lot of equity. We were also able to get Section 8 vouchers for the tenants. The outcome of this project is that there are 74 units. 54 of the households were previously homeless, families and individuals, and they're living in a community that they would have had no access to before. The schools in that community are great schools, and it's an opportunity. So the lessons learned in this project. First off, it's a great community. The building itself is a great community. Every time I walk into this building, I can feel the life of this building, and it's you can tell it's working for the families that live there. One of the challenges is that we didn't create any parking, and that wasn't required, and that's a very bold thing to do, even in our world. And I think that's a big lesson learned, that you probably, for some families need their cars for work. And so it's been challenging. So the next project I want to talk about is Compass at Ronald Commons, which people might be familiar with because it's in Shoreline. So this is a project that is a partnership between a church, a social service agency, and a nonprofit. And all those partners had to agree agree on what they needed to make this project work. So the church sold the land where the housing was built Compass, with the help of Beacon, was the developer. And we sold a part of the project to HopeLink to provide a service center, a food bank in the building. So it's a mixed-use affordable housing project. And in order to make this project work, it's on a campus. We also had to do shared parking. So it was not a simple process first to get everyone's needs met and then to get the approvals to make it work. And so, so what really made the difference with this project was that the city of Shoreline did so many things to help it happen. First off, they adopted changes to the development code to make the housing the housing as we had planned it work in terms of parking and other things. They supported the project through their through advocacy with the state. You know, they talked about it. It was their project. They gave fee waivers for the project, and throughout supported in any way they could to make it happen. And this was one of the first developments in the new town center zoning in Shoreline. So in some ways for them, it became an anchor for the development that they hoped to happen. And so, you know, the wonderful part about that project was the partnerships. It was also the hard part about that. It took many, many, many hours of just meetings and conversation and to make that project work. You know, it's not something that someone would do unless it was a mission-driven reason to do it. Let's see. You know, I think with both of these projects, they both brought beautiful new development to the neighborhood. You know, this idea of, I mean, that's the reality. It improved the landscape of the neighborhoods. And they also bring economic and cultural diversity to the neighborhood in both of these examples. And I think it also gives they've given an opportunity for the community to support something that's good in their community. People come out and they want to support it. Although, you know, there's people that don't support it, but there's many, many people that understand that there's a lot of people that are struggling, and this is exactly what they need. So, you know, both of these projects that I'm talking about have very low income, set-asides for homeless families, mixed populations, and they both work as, you know, they both work as that in that model. So those are my comments.
Great. Any quick clarification questions? And don't forget, okay, yes.
Yeah, there were 60 units in total. There's about half of the units are twos and threes, and the other halves are studios and ones. And homeless families, homeless veterans were about half of the units. And then we had some units that were just for general low income affordable units.
So, no, yeah, quick clarification. If you have more questions, that's what the cards are. So everyone remember to write your questions down because we want to get through all our panelists. It was a clarifying question you had?
I think what I was looking at is what you're saying with the percentage. The question would be, how did they qualify? Who gets the lucky ticket? Maybe that's a question you can answer later.
I'll give you a quick response to that, and then we can follow up if you like later.
Yeah. So they qualify based on their income. So in this particular project, people earned less than 30% of area median income and less than 50% of area median income, and by household size, and that's the baseline by which people qualify. Yeah.
And do you do like a lottery at some point, or?
You don't do a lottery. I wasn't there when they opened it. I'm not sure what they did.
Different places do different things. If
Yes.
they get more than, some do lotteries, some do other approaches. First come, first serve. It's done a little bit differently in different places.
Yeah.
Okay? So I'm now going to, the first two presenters are ones that you heard, and they use light touches on sort of using resource tools from public sources, such as property taxes and taxes and finance. Others use a heavy touch. Now you're going to hear a completely different approach, because the needs are so great. Cities have had to branch out and say, how can we also involve the private sector? Are there ways we can work with the private sector to get a more diverse forms of housing? And Eric Campbell, in his previous life and his current life, has been one of those developers stepping up to that plate. So, Eric.
Thanks, Arthur. Hi, I'm Eric Campbell, and thanks for having me speak to you tonight. We're going to have a couple slides. Look at that. Fantastic. I know pictures are always more fun than just speaking. So real quick, first I want to give you, I want to speak on two projects that we've done, and then I'll also hit upon another one. And then I'm going to speak a little bit at the end about accessory dwelling units too, and some opportunities for the cities up on the north end of the lake. So to let everyone know, I've been in the home building business for over 30 years, and my very first company was Cam West Development, which was one of the leading home builders until we sold it to Toll Brothers in 2011. And Arthur and I have a long history together. I was actually maybe his first or second project where we had, quote, inclusionary housing in one of our projects by being innovative. And in all sincerity, it worked out fantastic. And I also had the experience that it's amazing. I did not know the word affordable was a dirty four-letter word when it came to neighborhood groups. And so Arthur helped steer me through that process. And that was in the city of Kirkland, where we had two homes that were so innovative that we put a duplex in one of our single-family neighborhoods. And those duplexes at the time, this is back in the mid-1990s, sold for about $140,000. And needless to say, that was for those people who were fortunate to purchase that, a great opportunity. Okay, first example. This is North Creek Bungalows, actually in the city of Bothell, but this is a project which was we utilized this same concept in the city of Kirkland for what we call a demonstration project. And this is the concept of saying, instead of building larger single-family homes, can you build dual boxes, same amount of square footage, but have more units? So this is trying to, and so for everyone in the audience, it's like, if you look at many of these neighborhoods, you say, instead of having a 10-lot subdivision, could you have 20 single-family homes, but have them only be one-car garages and be quite a bit smaller? So same number of square footage. So if you could imagine, if you had a 10-lot plat, in Kenmore now, or Bothell, you're probably looking at 3,500 to 4,000 square foot homes. So let's say 40,000 to round up. Instead, these homes here range about right around 1,500 square feet, actually a little bit less, one-car garages. And the benefit of this is twofold for affordability. First and foremost, just on the market rate, the ones that have no requirements whatsoever, they're priced quite a bit lower than what the market is. So now all of a sudden, you're opening up more housing to people who are, wanting to get into your neighborhood. And you can tell from these pictures, this is the traditional housing that you might have seen back in Ballard or in the Wallingford area, Green Lake area, back at the, in the 1920s or so on. Very, very popular. The twist here, and this is a little small, but what the city of Bothell and allowed us to do, you see these two little detached homes and this one here, to hit affordability, i.e. in this case, a home price 80% affordable to 80% of the median income. And not to get too technical, we have to work with Arch to come up with a calculation saying, hey, we take a look what the median income is, do the math, and these themselves, like today, would be around about $280,000 for our median income. And so this is what Arch has done throughout King County, or I should say the east side cities. And what was great about this project, we actually were able to put 3 units in this project that, you can imagine in today's world, selling something this nice for $230,000. So that's just that incremental help. And people say, well, why does that matter? You'd be surprised, you start doing 10% of a project throughout the community, that takes care of a lot of people in the community. You know, you have an extra 100, 200, 300 units a year being developed. Incrementally, before you know it, you have housing stock. That makes a big difference. But this is just that one example. I just want you, the theme here is, don't think about density as a negative word as much as saying, how much do you want to allow to be built, and let a developer be creative and say, instead of having a big home, how about 2 smaller homes? And so that's just a concept. Now let me show you the next slide. This is a lot more complicated. This is a project, this is called Greenbrier. This is a project that Arthur actually spearheaded. This was a 22-acre site up in Woodinville, which was one of the finalists for Brightwater. And this is King County Solid Waste had owned this, and Arthur had identified it along with King County as one of the surplus pieces of property. Just a little side note, we thought it was surplus property until the 11th hour before we were ready to buy it, and all of a sudden we found out that King County Real Property had not told Solid Waste that they were actually selling it, and that was a interesting politics. That's where Arthur had to dance really quick, along with Ron Sims and so on. So that was a great time. But let me tell you the concept here real quick. 22-acre parcel. 11 acres of that was a wetland. So this is really an 11-acre parcel, and with 78 single-family homes, market rate, 50 senior housing. This is this picture here of low-income rental housing. Another 50 family rental housing, which is not similar kind of design shape between these 2 projects. And then 11 affordable cottages right down here. This is ones that actually had no garages. And this project, what made it so interesting is all the kind of the cast of characters. First and foremost, Arthur had to do a lot of pre-development work. And this is when you hear strategies saying, does a city or a jurisdiction or even a church have some existing land left over they'd like to target for affordable housing? Then the question is, how do they want to achieve it? In this one case, the county needed some money, so they wanted to have some level of money being purchased for it. That's where I came in, being the developer, saying, okay, we can pay some amount for the 78 housing units if we, but they also had it prescribed. They wanted affordable housing and low-income housing. So we partnered up with a nonprofit called DASH, and we made an RFP saying this is what we'll deliver. Here's the one thing I want to kind of talk to the group about, which is unique. Like Dan spoke to earlier, very few of the nonprofits have the ability to have the cash to close on something very quick. That's where a private developer comes in. And thus what we promised to do is to sell the land back to the nonprofit here at these 3 other locations within the development. The benefit that was, it gave almost 24 months for the nonprofit to obtain the financing. And if anyone wants to get into the nitty and gritty, you can either talk to Beth, Dan, or Arthur about all the financing. All I can say, I've never seen so many applications for such little soft money. I mean, it is mind-boggling how difficult it is for the nonprofits to deal with. I had the easy side. I just had to, develop it and be creative with the site plan. A second benefit of working with a private developer along in conjunction with a nonprofit, nonprofits, their applications are scored and such that they can only pay so much money for land. Well, the problem when they're doing, quote, we call it greenfield development, they don't know what the cost is going to be once you start to develop it. In this one case, we had over $1 million cost overrun, and we had prescribed that we would only sell the parcels, basically we gave them away free to the nonprofit. By being the for-profit developer, we were able to pass those costs. Fortunately, the economy was, rebounding from 9/11 to just raise house prices by only $5,000 per unit. So that's the flexibility that the partnership with a private and a nonprofit works together. Of course, what's the benefit for a private developer working with a nonprofit is the ability to obtain the land. I mean, because, part of the scoring of RFP was how much affordable housing was to be provided. And that's the one thing with any time any government or any nonprofit or, anyone who's trying to say, how do I best leverage my land? They all have different scoring mechanisms. Some may want more affordable housing. Other people may want more, park space. Other people, may ask for more infrastructure improvements. So every RFP is unique in that one aspect. A couple other things, just to speak real quickly about this one project, is that the upfront work that was done by Arch that did all the necessary approvals for traffic concurrency, for the permitting of the density and so on, really lowered the complexity of the project. And that's the one thing that we're always looking for to try to, so we can pay more as a developer. So so anytime a jurisdiction can do upfront permitting, that itself will enable the, whoever that, either they're selling the land themselves or they want to get more affordability, is taking the risk out of the process. Minimizing risk will always yield higher benefit, be it price and or type of units to be built. Lastly, what I'd like to speak real quickly about is accessory dwelling units. We ourselves have done those in the past, and you've heard a lot about accessory dwelling units, and that's basically is really there's 3 different ways to do it. Dan and I were talking before this meeting, and he reminded me of really the easiest way to do an accessory dwelling unit, and that is, as we know in Kenmore and Bothell, we have a lot of the old splits or daylight ramblers, where you actually have the ability to actually put a unit within an existing house. And many of the splits that I've always, when we used to go in there and, sell them when I was in college, have a perfect, built-in opportunity to have that living space in the basement of the split. And that is a great way to, if it's easy to permit within a city, to really help, especially our Asian population, to have them that ability to get more income for the property within the house without having to do a lot of infrastructure improvements. The second option is what we call the accessory dwelling unit, is that detached garage in the back corner of the lot of many of these homes, like in the Kenmore and Bothell area. It's still pretty large lots. And as we all know, you just go to West Bellevue, and now it's slowly progressing to Kirkland. You're starting to see these older homes torn down, and you're seeing these huge houses being built. And so, this is a phenomenon. And so the question is, do you want to give people the opportunity to stay within their neighborhood? And one of the opportunities to do that is allow that detached unit to be built in the back. So either A, the person could, sell that in the back, or live in that small little unit in the back and then sell the house up front. So that's, again, something that's not been done as well as it could be and should be, because unfortunately, I think both Bellevue and Kirkland, have not allowed that bifurcation of the property. They're trying to get their head around it, but I think it's actually, unfortunately, in Kirkland, probably too late, because now the prices of land of Bellevue have gone up so much. And like in my neighborhood, I think there's, over 25 houses being torn down at this moment. It's just old homes go, and so be it. So the accessory dwelling is a great way to really build a lot more affordable housing within the community, and especially when it's built in, people would be surprised. I think a lot of people would be really pleased if they could just get anywhere from $800 to $1,200 a month. And it's a great way to have a lot more affordability within our own neighborhoods. And of course, people always ask, well, is there enough parking? Many, and this is where, the cities have to, do the profiling of the neighborhoods to see, but in neighborhoods like we call Education Hill and Redmond and parts of, of Bothell, big roads, huge roads, we have plenty of parking, so those neighborhoods could easily access that. So that's kind of my experience on the private side. Being very fortunate to be working with a bunch of cities that are very innovative and really kind of borrowing from the past to bring to the future. And so hopefully that stirs some interesting questions or thoughts.
Okay. Any quick clarifying question for Eric? Okay, so now you have a choice. You can write down some questions and hand them to Lori real quick and get a cookie and some coffee, or I'll come up with questions. But I've been doing this a long time, so I would much prefer to have questions from you, because then you'll get your questions answered, or you can, and things like that. So let's take 5 minutes, and I mean 5 minutes, and if you have questions, give them to Lori or Debbie in the greenish sweater, and help yourself to cookies and coffee in the back. Thanks for the comments, guys. You can go get a cookie and coffee.
What's the population over at Ronald Farmers?
I realize I must have kind of skipped over that. It's really,
I know you got the best. I've already helped myself, though. Thank you.
no, I'm good, thank you. There's 12, there's actually 12 units that are set aside for homeless families. And then there's 12 units set aside for veterans. And the rest,
are those mostly considered single veterans as primarily?
4 families.
4 families, okay.
Yeah. We got 8 vouchers through King County
Right.
Housing Authority. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and then
So how many units are there?
60.
60.
Yeah.
Okay, so the balance is?
So it's 24. Oh, you mean in terms of bedroom size?
No, in terms of you got 60-some units, right?
Yep. Being further out, that is the pressure on that place is just going.
Well, you're going to see any low density type. That's what I said about the apartments.
Yep. I was in Tukwila a little while ago, and it just struck
Okay.
me, like the housing stock is so.
We can get going while you're still collecting your final cookies and things like that. And I'm not sure we're going to get to all of these, but we'll do as best we can. So afterwards, maybe after we do this for about 15 minutes or so, I'm going to ask, we have lots of questions, so I'm going to ask the panelists to be short and to the point with their responses. And we'll get through a number of these. And if you feel your question wasn't gotten to, sorry, we can't get to them all potentially. Feel free, if any of them can stay a little longer during the informal period while you're filling out and doing the sheets, we'll mull around too, and you can ask your questions there. But the first question was, what's the minimum amount of space needed to develop a project, and is there a minimum number of units?
Well, I'll just start off, but these two folks have done a lot of more recent new development. I don't know if there's a minimum, but certainly there are economies of scale in doing larger scale projects. I don't think you can go too small. And Eric and Beth can talk a little bit more about it, but you really do need a reasonable plot of land to be able to build a substantial apartment or multifamily complex. I don't know, you can go anywhere from maybe a quarter of acre, half acre, maybe that's too small, depending on your density. You see in the city of Seattle where you can have a high vertical housing, you can actually do a lot on a relatively small plat as long as you have structured and underground parking. You want to take a shot at that, Beth?
Yeah, so it is hard to make the economics work with smaller projects. So, typically 50 units would be the smallest. We also, though, in our world have, we can't go that big either because we also there's not enough funding sources to do large projects. So it's really a range of about 50 to, at the most, 120, 150 at the most. And it all depends on the zoning of a site.
Well, my point would be is that you can go as small as a single-family lot, depending upon what you want to do. And so that gets back to even an ADU. You can have that. If you can produce something and have it for less than $200,000, that's incredibly affordable today. So I think the reality is everything will work. Many things like what Beth and Dan do require a lot of services, right? So that's what increases the size of those properties. So I think, when you get smaller, you're going to be targeting really, we were talking about previously, that prototypical teacher, someone who's working, for, not the prevailing, wages you can get at Amazon or Microsoft. So there's a lot of different strategies. So really, anything helps. So I would say nothing's too small.
But I will say that from a rental housing operation standpoint, you really want to be more in that 50, hopefully more like 100 units. The scattered site rental housing has been attempted. It's very inefficient. It's hard to manage. And oftentimes from a rental and an institutional management standpoint, doesn't work very well at all.
Yeah, my point was for sale, and that's where the success is at that 80%, below market for sale product.
Okay, I have a couple under the theme of kind of ownership housing. So are there things being done to help people in lower income housing move into ownership forms of housing?
Well, Arthur can probably you should answer this question yourself. I mean, because this is where the Arch and this is where, real quick, is it when we have projects where we are, like in North Redmond, where we have some inclusionary zoning requirements based upon the up zones, that's where there's actually these units that are so below the market, like if they're for sale for $280,000 and the prevailing houses in the neighborhood are $650,000, there is a process through where a potential buyer would go through a regional coalition for housing to be put onto that list and then notified when those type of housing units are available. So that's just one method. There are other methods that have been out there through other various groups, but I don't know, Arthur, you want to talk about some other programs?
So Eric was just referring to a number of cities in East King County and around, but in East King County have programs that require affordability. And if the builder's building ownership units, then the ones that are priced at moderate income are also ownership units. And those have long-term restrictions on them. They have appreciation that's limited. So there are now over 600 homes in East King County, some are in Kenmore, that have been created for ownership units through various cities' land use programs over the last 20 years. So that gets to Eric's earlier point about slowly but surely at some point you start to get to a point of some significant impact. Also, Dan's presentation, the beginning. Manufactured housing, the people who live there consider themselves, and they are, homeowners. And that has been one of the most affordable forms of home ownership. And Dan mentioned one project, and there was another project by another group that was preserved in East King County where the landowner, you don't own the land, but you own your unit. So that's been another tool that has been used to create ownership opportunities, and you heard one example tonight. And so, any more there? Okay, so next question is, what can regular residents do? So I'm going to take two questions and sort of put them together. First is, what can regular residents do to support affordable housing efforts in our cities? And I'm going to also tie in a question, what can cities do to also help support groups like the Housing Authority or the nonprofits in their efforts to create affordable housing?
Well, I'll take a shot at that one. A couple things, the issue is just a very daunting economic issue of supply and demand. And it really is the fact there's way too much demand for available supply. It's basic economics, and that's why prices are going up. And I think we've just had growth that's outpaced supply, and anything you as a citizen can support that helps to increase both the land supply, which is the amount of units that can be built on land, or the development of additional units. And it's one of those things that's highly controversial. It's kind of the thing that's hard to handle if it's right in your neighborhood to say, yeah, we're going to go with whether it's smaller lots or allow duplexes or allow the encroachment of multifamily in my neighborhood. But those are all things that have to happen to have an impact on the price. Now, the cities are kind of in that same place, that they have to figure out where housing can happen, where can more housing be built. And again, that's always a tricky political problem to figure out where that can go. I'm in Bellevue, and Bellevue's basically decided it either goes in downtown or in the Bellred corridor, and both those places are incredibly expensive to develop, especially downtown Bellevue, almost impossibly expensive for nonprofit housing. But everything else in the city is pretty much off limits from the standpoint of a development of multifamily housing. So we've got ourselves into this dilemma, and the question as citizens and as community members, how do we sort of start making encroaching a little bit on dealing with the issue, and it's a hard one. I will recognize that. And the final thing is just funding. It's expensive. The reason that, as Beth alluded to, that you can only do relatively small projects is because there just isn't enough money to do it. I mean, there's only the tax credit program, and I won't go into that, but that's the big driver of low-income housing. There's maybe enough tax credits in King County for 2, maybe 3 projects outside the city of Seattle in any one year. So that means all of the east side, Arthur, is that about right? Maybe you get 1 if you're lucky, and that's it. And that's just not going to make a dent in the problem. So it's funding, it's availability of land, and it's supporting additional development.
Yes, when I would say also that you know, whenever there is a project in your neighborhood, or you hear of something that someone's trying to do, come out and support it, because people need to hear from the community that they support affordable housing. And there's a lot that cities can do. Cities make projects by their willingness and their support. And so people have alluded to inclusionary zoning, where the city provides opportunities for more affordable housing to go in. Fee waivers, they give breaks to affordable housing. There's ways that cities can reduce the parking requirements for affordable housing, permit fees. There's funding, direct funding. So there's many ways that cities can support housing.
Sounds good.
Okay. So I'm just going to read, because they're questions that I think are sort of statements at the same time, so I'm just going to read a couple of these. And just so that I put them out there, and what we'll be doing too is matching up these questions with the things that are in the back of the room, so that as the cities that I work with go forward in the future, we'll keep these kind of comments in mind. So one is, I understand that the cities of Renton and Kent are considering having apartment inspections and standards because of the conditions of apartments rented to immigrants. Is there such a problem in North County? I would say probably to a lesser degree, but there's always properties around there. And actually, Housing Authority helped preserve a property in Bothell a few years ago that had exactly that issue occurring with it. So it does occur, maybe not to the same degree. So that, I think, is sort of a statement. Is it too cynical to imagine affordable housing is being invoked to evade zoning, density, and parking issues? So there's sometimes two sides to this story. Are we just doing density, and are we preserving community character? And how do we address community character? So maybe I'll put that out as a question like that is, how do you fit in, or how do you address community character issues so that the housing that's, quote, affordable or different and stuff feels like it's a good part of the community?
Well, that's why I kind of showed those examples of the North Creek bungalows and so on, is that I think, a lot of, let's say the neighborhoods have to kind of look and say, well, what do we want our neighborhoods to look like 10 or 20 years down the road? And many times, working with neighborhood groups, I've seen neighborhoods say, well, we want to preserve it as is. But unfortunately, all of a sudden, the other surrounding neighborhoods, the situation is all of a sudden your neighbor's home is being torn down because now it's so affordable. People are saying, oh, God, look at this huge 12,000 square foot lot. So I think, that some of the tools about with neighborhood groups is saying, what do we really want to envision ours? And I really think if you look around and talk to people, it's amazing how many people would rather have smaller home sites now, because they just the days of having that huge lot, especially if there's nice parks by and so on, is there's a lot of people that you can have high quality architecture and be small. Now the other aspect is we've been part of is when you see, like, be it downtown Kenmore or downtown Bothell or Redmond, many cities have said, we got the right infrastructure, and we rather see a mixed use, opportunity than seeing get rid of some of the old strip centers, get rid of the old parking lots. So it really, again, it comes down to the neighbors, or I should say the residents speaking and saying, look, this is where we envision our city. And I would say, I think people will be hard-pressed to find which one of the affordable housing projects. I think the best one we can talk about, locally is South Kirkland Parker Ride. For any of those who have been there, you'll see there's brand new apartments. I doubt you could pick which buildings is the affordable project. There's one of them, just to let you know, where people who pay only 30% of their median income. And it was a great project between Polygon Northwest and Imagine Housing. So that's just an example where affordable housing could look fantastic and, not change the character.
Okay. Do you want to?
Well, I think the other part of that question, and one you hear a lot of, isn't just about architecture. It's also about whether renters, whether you have lower income people, whether that is in keeping with the character of my neighborhood. I don't know if many of you watched the Frontline documentary a week ago, Tuesday, and they were interviewing a Texas housewife in a very affluent neighborhood, and there was this controversy about a low-income housing multifamily development, and she was just going on and on. I'm not discriminatory, but they're just not our kind of people, and we're not comfortable having them here kind of thing. It was a very awkward, trying to be pleasant about it, but I think that is also part of that question. It isn't just a question of architecture. It's usually looking upon renters as not really being part of my community if you're a single-family homeowner. And I do believe, though, that you're seeing that where the renter population is continuing to grow, many people now prefer to rent that could have afforded to buy homes. So that's kind of changed in the last 10 years. But hopefully the management, and as you get to know your neighbors, it's not as threatening as it might seem. But certainly we see an awful lot of that kind of immediate reaction. It's understandable. But it's also a matter of just experiencing the diversity that is our country and our community.
So I'm going to ask Beth or Dan, I'm going to challenge you to take that one step further, because one of the other questions is, what is the case for economic and ethnic diversity as a good thing, and is there more than just a moral argument to make?
Well, let me add one thing that's really interesting to Dan's point, and then I'm going to let Beth speak to this. What we have found, and I've served on Imagine Housing for 9 years, and it was kind of funny. I was talking to Anya beforehand. So one thing that I think is always an elephant in the room is that there's plenty of studies. Rental housing, and especially to say lower income, which people are always worried about. The great thing about the regional arches, methodology is dispersion. If we have smaller projects, these 50 to 150 units, that is not high levels of concentration. That is easily absorbed if it's family housing within an elementary school. We just, it's when you get to larger sizes where it starts to have a lot of impact. So one of the benefits of having dispersion, i.e., be it, a small percentage of a project or so on, is that overall it fits within the fabric and it's not like, oh, that's the projects. That's one of the benefits that we have found, and it's been very successful. And this is, working with, a lot of this, schools, and that's where it's always a tough subject. People don't like to talk about it, but that's really been a proven strategy. And this is, and this, of course, came out of Chicago where they had all the, they still have the problems when they decide to, big federal subsidy dollars and put all the affordable housing or the low-income housing in one spot. The dispersion of having, and this just gets one on the morality side, maybe, is that if you want to stretch your dollars from the taxpayers, the best thing we can do is to put young kids into the better school districts. And right now, and this is something when I was a little kid, our Grace Lutheran Church, we would take families out of this, at the time was a poor area in Seattle, and buy houses in Kirkland for $17,000. And give them the Lake Washington School District, But it just shows you how, small things. But that's just a strategy. It's a great way to really get a bang for your buck, especially for children, is you put them in the better school districts. And I'm not saying it's good or bad about some of these other school districts. It's just the reality is that they just do a lot better.
And let me just give you a quick example, because it's not moral arguments. It's definitely an economic one. I think I mentioned I live in Bellevue. Now, you may not know this, but Bellevue is majority minority. In other words, the majority of people in Bellevue are immigrants and minorities. Over 50% of that population. Now, most of them work for Microsoft, but just the same, that minority and immigrant community drives the economy. The apartment complex that I think I mentioned that we bought that was going to be torn down in Bellevue, right in the middle of Bellevue, about 90% Hispanic. These are all working families. They volunteered in the schools. They might work 3 jobs, but a lot of the service work that's done in that community is done by these folks. And while my point is simply being, they are very much part of the mainstream in Bellevue. And unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at it, we are becoming more diverse. It's just the demographics of this, both of this area and of this country. And they're part of the economy, they're part of the community. And I know that in Bellevue, they say we welcome the world. That's their thing, and they really do try to say that and say it sincerely. So and I think that's kind of what it's all about. It's part of our sort of who we are, and it's certainly what this country is all about.
I said one thing. There's also some recent research that that people have been doing, a particular author, about how housing policy created segregation in our country very explicitly through creating public housing that was only but for primarily African American, and excluding African Americans from suburban neighborhoods in the 1950s. So we have developed a housing policy that has segregated our communities, and before that time they were more naturally integrated. And so what is we do not benefit when we segregate ourselves by class or race, because we don't understand other people, and we see them as others. So I guess that's the moral argument, but there it is.
So I'm gonna use my pulpit here to use some of your questions to answer your question, maybe. I would be happy if my 20 to 30-year-old sons lived in SROs at lower rents. But many don't favor SROs as desirable and livable. What do you think? Some of the permitting should encourage separate entry housing that allows families with special needs, adult children, so they have access to housing. Another person asked, how long is the waiting list that exists out there, especially for seniors? These are all people in your community that are struggling to live in your community. This is not importing an issue. I came here, I started in the Bay Area. Someone else, what are the statistics that help explain this issue? What are the simple statistics? These are the statistics that people in your community who struggle. The other statistic that I often use is I look at who lives in the housing that we have created through the cities, the efforts of the cities working in partnership with groups like this. The YWCA built a property for people at 30 to 60% of median income. Everyone there must be in that income range. That's pretty low. Up in Issaquah Highlands. Where do they work? Most of them are working. They work at Swedish Hospital. They work at 5, 6, 7 different banks in town. They work for school districts. They work for child care. They work in the restaurants. They work in your community. The amount of need for your workforce in your community, for the jobs, most of your jobs pay low income in your community, as do most of the jobs in East King County. Even though we have a lot of jobs at high end, we also have a lot of jobs that aren't high-end, and they're an integral part of making your community complete. If you had no restaurants, it wouldn't be as nice. If you had no hospitals, that wouldn't be good. So I think that's part of what the answer is to the question that was asked, and you've been asking those questions yourself, which tells you it's probably there's an issue going on out there if you're aware of it as well. Okay? So that's my kind of response to that question. And so now I'm trying to see. So I think we've hit a lot of the questions. I'm going to stop there because we've gone for an hour and 20 minutes now. If anyone has a dying question that they think everybody needs to hear the answer to, I will give one last chance for that. Otherwise, feel free, and we hope you do take some time to take a few minutes to fill out stickies and put them up on the boards, or for those of us who can hang around, ask your one-on-one questions. But go ahead.
Of the municipalities. I'm not coming down
So the question is, so we can, is
I just like to see where the conversation is, where part of the accountability is the municipalities
Right.
are still getting their money. And it does not help with affordable housing. Therefore, the municipalities are all talking about affordable housing, but they're part of the problem too.
okay, so that's a statement sort of,
And but a
right.
question too. Yeah.
Okay, any of you have a response to that, and then we'll wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is about the impact fees is that the cost of, of infrastructure. We've just said, hey, they're trying to put more direct costs onto development versus raising taxes for the populace, and this is kind of, one of the things like Beth was alluding to is that the benefit for why many people like this, they say, God, if I raise impact fees, housing cost goes up by $30,000, my home goes up in value. The only problem is if they have children or relatives that want to move into the neighborhood, now it's more expensive. And so it's always, unfortunately, is many times we have policies put in place and people are thinking about just in the short term, not the long term. And I think the reality, to your question is, it's not the municipalities' issue as much as, hey, those people, that's really kind of what was voted in. I mean, as you know, unfortunately, being part, I serve on the Lake Washington School Board's, kind of advisory committee for the last bond and helping them on on school issues. I will say this, the more you know, the more shell-shocked you get. We just don't make it easy on anybody. And we get stuff that comes from the state, Olympia or the federal government. Everything's more complex because we just are trying to serve more people. And so there is no easy solution. I think but to get to your point is that on one hand, yes, law costs have gone up. I mean, like, Dan alluded to, him and I were talking about, if you wanted to do subdivide your home site, you'd be shocked how much it costs to upgrade the storm sewer, the water, the power, and all that. But unfortunately, 40 years ago, King County didn't require very high standards. So there's no easy answer. There's a lot of catch-up to be done, and there's a lot of infrastructure that we have to pay for.
Yeah.
I think, but it does get back to that early point that I made. How do we pay for the cost of growth? How do we finance that? And do we add $10,000 to the cost of every new home or new unit being built, or is there a better way to do it? I've always made the argument we all benefit economically from growth. Our incomes go up, our businesses do better, depending on what you do for a living. But the problem in this state is that I think the tools that are available to municipalities are somewhat limited. I'm not a city guy, so I can't really tell you, but I'm sure if you sat down with your city finance director, they would sort of explain why they're forced to go to impact fees, not that they necessarily want to, just like school districts and special purpose districts, including, we're all paying for the Brightwater sewer plant, and that gets passed through. So all of those things get paid for one way or another. It's a question of who pays.
So for the wrap-up tonight, I had that comment, but I think the takeaway for tonight is as complex as the world is to deal with issues and how that makes it even harder on affordable housing. You've heard tonight from 3 different players who have found ways to find their way through the maze that we just talked about, and hopefully you can see that, yes, as hard as it is, there are solutions out there, and you've hopefully learned a little bit about some groups who are being very successful at developing solutions, and hopefully maybe some of these are things that Kenmore, Bothell, and Woodinville, and other cities in North End can look harder at in the next few years. So I want to thank the panelists for being here tonight, and thank you for coming out tonight and taking the time to learn a little bit. And again, please share your thoughts with us. And again, thank you for coming out tonight. And do you have any wrap-up comments?